It will afterwards.
A young man there on the outside.
Please pray with me. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for the Christmas season when we get to be with each other and with our family and our friends. And we thank you most of all that you sent Jesus for us. We pray that you will use this time today to further form us into people who might serve you and Jesus. We pray this in his name. Amen. Amen. Come on in. You're fine. Some of you got to sit in the front, unfortunately.
Well, you can sit anywhere. You've got the cookies.
Anybody want one? Go for it.
So, today we're going to talk about the Christmas stories. You should have a handout. It's got Luke chapter 2 on it. We talked a bit about the verses 8 through 20 last week. We're going to focus today on verses 1 through 7. So this is the famous story, right, that we read every Christmas season. And this is the story we get. So it happened, I'm going to read the first 7 verses. It happened that in those days an edict went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. I'm going to pause and make some comments. Well, Luke cares a lot about giving us dates. So he's dating this here. He's giving us world historical information. So who is Caesar Augustus? Anyone know their Roman history? This is Octavius Augustus, the adopted son of Caesar, the first one. So this is like emperor number 2 ever, right? We're early on, right? But he's telling us this is the time, right? They didn't have our calendar. They actually oftentimes started calendars over when you got a new emperor. But it's a way of giving us a date, right? And Caesar here is a name for him, but it's going to come to just mean emperor, right? We get the Kaiser in Germany or the Tsar in Russia. It's the same thing. So this was the first registration that happened before Quirinius was governor of Assyria. So the governor of the area is up north in Assyria. And everyone went to be registered, each to their own town. And Joseph also went up out of Galilee from the town of Nazareth to Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was from the house and family of David, to be registered with Mary, who was betrothed to him and was with a child. And it happened while they were there that the time came for her to give birth. And she gave birth to her firstborn son and wrapped him in bands of cloth and laid him in a manger because there was no place for them in the guest room. That's what I'm going to call it, and you'll see why. Right, so I have a picture. We'll talk about all that. I don't draw often, but today I thought it would help. Couple of things that I will begin to help us see what I want to do today. So look at verse 4. We get directions. But Joseph also went up out of Galilee from the town of Nazareth to Judea to the city of David. Right? Which direction do you think they're going?
North.
South?
Hold on. Someone said north. Why do you think north?
Because it's up.
Because it's up, right? This is how we tend to think, say, you go up, you go north, right? So this is what I want us to pay attention to, is we bring our own cultural assumptions to the text when we read it. We think up is north, but up here is going south. Why? Because Jerusalem is up high. It's on mountains, so you go up, right? It's accurate. It's just a different way of orienting yourself to it, right? So I warned you the other day, we're going to talk about the Christmas story, and I'm going to tell you that the way we tend to understand it has some errors in it. I want to be really clear about what it is I'm doing. I'm not saying there's a conspiracy theory. Right? No one's hiding anything. This isn't some kind of Dan Brown thing, right? It's rather that within a couple hundred years after the whole Jesus event happened, right? the Christian idea took off outside of Palestine. It took off in Europe, right? And there was distance between European culture and Palestinian culture, right? And so there were errors that came to enter in of how we understood the story. So I'm also not saying the Bible's wrong. I'm just saying we need to pay attention to what it's actually saying and be aware that we bring our own cultural assumptions to this all the time. So I just gave you one. I'm going to give you a more contemporary one. If you go to Great Britain and order a meal and you ask for chips, what are you going to get?
French fries.
French fries, right? So part of it is down to what does a word mean, right? We read into ideas of what words mean, and words change over time, right? So here's how the Christian story tends to be, the Christmas story tends to be understood. The Holy Family arrives late at night. The local inn doesn't have any room. There's no vacancy. The sign outside. They try desperately to find a room. They can't find any. The only option available to them is somebody's barn. Maybe it's in a cave, right? Because the baby's coming right now, right? And they've got to go find a place to stay, and the baby's born in a barn and all this sort of thing. Play the baby in a feed trough and all that, right? Not what's going on. I can tell you this, right? So the first thing I actually want to pay attention to is the date, right? This, even here we're going to get into some issues. So when was Jesus born? What can we actually give a year? So how does our calendar work? What year is it? 2021. Supposedly Jesus was born 2,021 years ago. Right? It's off just a little bit. Right? The family returns from Egypt, we're told in Matthew, after the death of King Herod. That's Herod the Great, the first one. There's a bunch of Herods. It's confusing, but Herod, we know, dies in 4 BC. This is a fact we can pretty much guarantee, right? And if Herod wants to kill babies that are up to 2 years old, that gives us a range. Jesus is probably born between 6 and 4 BC, right? This guy came up with a calendar in the 6th century. He did the math, got us back to the year 1. It says this is when I think Jesus was born. Calendar didn't actually catch on until the 9th century. It's had to have some tweaks to it over the years, but it's the calendar that we have. It's off by about 4 to 6 years. Pretty good, right? But that's what we can determine. There's a problem though. Luke dates this text here to a census when this guy Quirinius becomes governor, and we know he didn't become governor till 6 AD. So there's a gap here between their stories of about 10 to 12 years, right? If this is how we think that we did it, now notice I translated it in a very technical way. If you look at the way I said it, it's the first registration happened before. Most of the translations will say during, right, or a while, right? There's a good argument to be made that this is actually what Luke means, and this actually makes their dates correspond. But this is one of those things that, like, there are literally books written on just when did it happen and what's the conflict here and who's right and who's wrong, right? And I don't think it's that hard to sort of say both Matthew and Luke are right if we read them carefully and we do our historical work, right? It's actually an argument that this guy Quirinius was in the Assyria area before as well, right? So it could actually be either way. So all to say, you may hear people say there's a contradiction here in the dates. At face value, there is. I think there's ways to solve the problem to say actually they agree. We can date Jesus' birth to about between the 6 and 4 BC. Right? By the way, when he died, it's either the year 30 or 33. We're not really sure, but it's one of those dates. So he's either like 36 or 39 in there when he's crucified. Right? Okay, that's just the date stuff. So there's no room in the inn, no room in the guest room. The problem with the way that we tell the story is it doesn't fit either the text or the culture or really what we know about the people here. Right? The thing that I always get offended at when I read the typical version is Joseph looks like an idiot. Right? He's like he looks incompetent. It's like he can't arrange a room in his hometown for them to stay in. Right? Which does not fit the culture at all. Right? He can basically go up there and say, "I'm the son of," I forget all his parents' names, but he could go up there and say, right, "This is my dad. This is my grandfather. I can trace my hand ancestry all the way back to King David." Anybody's going to give him a room. His wife, fiance, is pregnant. No one is going to turn a pregnant woman out. Right? We wouldn't do that. They're even a more hospitable culture. There's people are going to be welcomed in. Anyone's going to give them a room.
Would this be part of the not stoning her for being pregnant out of
Well, so notice they're going up to a different town, right? So they're actually traveling. Maybe the news has gotten up there, but I think we can kind of assume not everybody knows. But Joseph, I hope, is smart enough to know, who can I go ask, right? And it is actually there, at this point, their marital status is unclear. Have they actually gotten married at this point? Right? It would be very odd for him to be traveling with her in this way alone if they hadn't actually at this point gotten married. So before, when she finds out she's pregnant, they are technically married.
Right.
They just haven't moved in with each other yet, which is what the problem is. I think we can assume at this point they have, right? So they are married, right? Which means they can stay in the same home. No one's going to care. Right? But there's this issue of there's no room in the inn. We'll come back to that. But I think they're going to get a place to stay, right? In fact, I think what we should be told is most of the people in this town where they're going to, right, are good Jewish people, and they're told to take care of strangers. Or even better, you love your neighbors, people that you know well. They're going to take care of them. Right, there's no way they can't find a room. So the typical story again is, what happens is they get up there, there's no place for them to stay. Someone finally takes pity on them and says, "You can sleep in my barn." That's the problem too, because they don't have barns. It's just not the way the culture works. There's very few stand-alone animal areas. Maybe if you're really, 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 really about 500 times wealthy, you might have one of those. Yep.
Wouldn't Joseph's family be the first door that he would knock
Absolutely,
on?
which is probably where they're at.
Okay.
I think we can almost say that they're at some of Joseph's family. This is the other problem. Remember earlier, Mary goes to visit Elizabeth in the hill country of Judea. This is probably a few miles away from Bethlehem. So if they really couldn't find a room, they'd say, "Well, it'll take us 2 hours to get to Elizabeth's house." Yeah.
Well, it sounds like, my understanding was when she started labor, sometimes you have a minute.
Right. I mean, so this is oftentimes how it gets read, right? But let's look at I got to pull up my sheet that has the verses on it again. And it happened. This is verse 6. It happened while they were there that the time came for her to give her birth. Right. The sort of contemporary scholarly take on this phrase is they'd been there a while, maybe even up to a month. They're not in a hurry, right? Because they wouldn't have done it. It's like getting on an airplane when you're 9 months pregnant. Like, this isn't a smart thing to do. Right? The census wasn't one of these things where it's like, you got a week to get here. Like, they would have told you like a month ahead of time. Right? It's about a 4-day trip. If you're going fast on foot, let's say they're taking their time because Mary is 8 months pregnant or something. Might take them a week. Right? There's no sense here actually that they're in a hurry. We tell ourselves that, but afterwards that kind of builds into it. Right? There's actually this text. It's a hard to, I talk about it later in my handout. It's a number 4. It's called the Infancy Gospel of James on the back page. Scholars call it a Christian novel. I think this is too kind. It's probably written at the earliest year 200. I would actually say it's a good 100 years afterwards. It's fan fiction. It reads like a junior high kid who really is into Harry Potter and wants to write like a story about what happened to Harry when he went to college. Right? It's so someone actually trying to tell you more of the story. Right? And actually it's focused on Mary. It's actually where we get the idea is that Joseph is really old and he's got all his other kids earlier. And then he basically, Mary is a young girl who's taken a vow to be a virgin, but they have to marry her off just to actually have someone to stay and then pick him. That's half of it. But then in this story, they travel up, and before they even get to Bethlehem, Mary goes into labor. They find a cave halfway there. They go and have a cave. They've got to have a midwife. Joseph goes out and finds one. The midwife doesn't believe their story about her being a virgin and goes in and does an inspection, and her hand plates on fire. I mean, it's just this ridiculous story, right?
That's the conspiracy.
But, I mean, and what it is trying to, I mean, it's written several hundred years after the fact. It's beginning to sort of give us arguments for certain doctrines that arise, like Mary's perpetually a virgin, Joseph is old, where do Jesus' brothers and his sisters come from? They're his kids from an earlier marriage, right? It begins to explain all of these things. But it also just has these strange things of like, when Jesus is born, time stops for a while, right? I mean, it's got these really weird things in it. But it's where we get some of these ideas of they're in a hurry, they've got to get their right away, it's a long journey. This person who wrote this other text, like, doesn't understand the geography at all, right? So we can tell that it's written way later. It's where some of these ideas come from, right?
So my question is if that's how it's written in the Bible,
Yeah.
why is it written in the Bible with all these conflicting
Because,
things going on?
so this is part of what we need to do, is just actually understand some of the terms, right? So if you look on my handout, I've got a big long footnote on the first page, right? I'm being fancy here. There is a perfectly good Greek word for inn, if what we mean is a hotel that we pay for. If we read the story of the Good Samaritan, he says, I'm going to take you to the inn. That's the word that's used. Pandokion is the word. It means a hotel that you pay for. This is not the word used in this story. The word here is kataluma, which means guest room. Only is used one other time in the New Testament. Also in Luke, it's a room that the Last Supper happens in. So it's a room in a house, right? It's not a hotel room. Right? So why do we get it translated as inn? Well, that's a long story of the history of the English language. Right? Inn didn't used to only mean a hotel. Right? It also used to mean a room in your house. So I've given you, I'm not going to read it all, but like Chaucer in Old English uses the word inn to talk about a room in his house. Right? Spencer, in a text written just before the King James Version, uses it to talk about a room in a house. So it can also mean it's a room in my house that I let other people stay in. It's a guest room. Right? So this is, we can actually tell that it is an accurate if outdated word. Right? And part of this just comes down to how are we going to think about how we should translate all these terms. I have a lecture I give to students. I'm not going to give it all to you now, but I call it the politics of Bible translation. And the verse I always turn to as the first example is John 3:16. Everybody who knows John 3:16. For God so loved the world. What does the word so mean in that sentence?
A lot.
Right.
A lot.
So that's what we tend to think it means. It means God loved the world so much, right? Which is true. It's not what the word means in that sentence. The Greek word being translated is just thus. Or this is a contemporary English translation of John 3:16. This is the way that God loved the world. Colon, he gave his only begotten son. It's not saying so much, it's so he did this. Right? Which is what the word so meant. That was the primary meaning of the word in the 1700s. Language changes. Right? But when people go to buy a Bible, that's the one verse everyone knows. So they open up to that verse, and if it says there's something odd, they don't buy it. So actually, the Bible publishers will not change the wording of certain things, even though it could be updated to more contemporary English, because they want to make money. Just as simple as it is, right?
Bill Clinton knew about this too.
I'm not going to comment on that. Right. So this is how we can think of this. So I mean, we ought to actually translate the term guest room. That's what it means. But inn can mean that. It just isn't a standard meaning, right? So that's the sort of the first point. So this gets us into this house. So I've tried to draw as best as I can. A first century Palestinian house, Israeli house. If you've been to Israel, you can actually still find houses like this now. The one thing I'll talk quickly about is there's this whole idea of it being in a cave. That could very well be the case, that this house that I've drawn up here is built into a cave. So there's a cave behind it. That's pretty common. So cave or not, we don't.
Just so you know.
Yeah.
It's plan view and elevation.
Elevated, yeah, I don't. This is from the side, and this is from on top. Next time I'll have you help me. All right, but so this is a standard house, right? And you can see I put the guest room on the side. Not all of them may have a guest room. This one does. But of course we have the animals in the house, which to us is like, well, of course it's not a house. There's animals around. He's put in a manger. Of course they're out in a barn, right? This is one of these big cultural things that we need to sort of say, they don't do things the way we do them. Right? The animals are in the house, right? So I draw this. Here's the house, how you enter into it. Here's the big door. Right? Inside the house are these steps. The family lives up here on this elevated area, and the animals are kept in here at night. Right? You let them out during the day. That's what you do. Why do you keep them in there at night? So they don't get stolen. They don't run away. And when it is cold, they keep the house warm. Right? So this is what they did. You can actually still find houses like this where Palestinian families will keep some of their cattle or their goats in the house, in this kind of a house. Right? In this space here, there'd be some gaps. So again, this is lower down, but high enough the animals can get their heads up to the platform, and that's where you'd put the food. The mangers, I've drawn little circles here, they're probably built into the floor. We call them mangers or food troughs. I think the word a manger just refers to this whole area. It's not actually he was necessarily laid in the food trough. They kept him here. Why? Because it's a good area. It's warm. Why? This is the family's living room, right? They do not have our ideas of sort of privacy, right? Everybody's there, at least all the women. So all the women in the family are there to be with Mary and help. Maybe the men got kicked out, we don't know, right? But they're all there, and they're going to stay there to help her. She's not on her own, right? Again, we have this idea of Mary's all on her own and has to wrap the baby up on her own, and no, she's got lots of people there helping her out.
I just have one question. So
Yeah.
if he possibly had made prior arrangements and that sort of thing,
Yeah.
where it says, and you say it was laid in the manger, which is an area.
Yeah.
So what do you think they would have put him in? They wouldn't have put him in a trough, a current trough. Where would they have? And I agree with you that it would
So
be.
I mean, this is where I think the biblical text is a bit ambiguous. Is it the trough? Well, if they're worried about him being swaddled and rolling around, that's not a bad spot, right? But it can also just be he's in this area, right? And they would have some kind of a crib, or people will just hold him. And again, I don't think it's just Mary on her own. I think she's got extended family here, right? She's doing just fine, right? If she wasn't, when the shepherds came, they would have gone, this is not okay. You will come to our house and you will stay with us. There's no way they would have allowed them to stay in a barn. Just wouldn't have happened. Right? So I mean, again, if we just pay attention to the culture, it helps us understand this story. Right? Why isn't there a room? I think we can probably read into this. Joseph did arrange to stay in the guest room. And they got there, and other people had come to town, also for the census, and they got there first, and they put them up in the guest room. And they said, why? And not because they got there first, but because she's pregnant, and while you're here, she's probably going to give birth. You should be with us. You should be where the family is, where we can take care of you, right? Again, we have this idea of Jesus as like this outcast, and they're being pushed out, right? It's actually the opposite. They're being welcomed by a very humble people. I mean, these are farmers and people who work with their hands, kind of economic class, right? And they're there to help, right? Everybody's helping everybody out, right? No one's been turned away. They're being welcomed, right? Taken care of, right? And actually, this kind of a house, this is a really important idea to have a house, because it actually helps us make a sense of all kinds of other biblical texts, right? So Jesus tells a parable or tells us a story about to a synagogue official, and tells him about taking his animals out of his house on the Sabbath. And we're told after Jesus tells this story, the guy is basically humiliated. Why? Because Jesus tells him, even you untie your animals and take them out of your house on the Sabbath, right? Because that's just true. If the guy had tried to tell the crowd, I didn't, they would have laughed at him. You took your animals out of the house because you don't want them in the house all day long. It's going to start to smell, right? But you took every morning would have been somebody's job to untie the animals in the house, take them out, clean it out. In fact, these houses, even when the way that they're built, there's actually a decline this way and a decline coming out so you can sweep things flowed down, right? Just if we know the context, the story makes sense, right? Two more. There's two really weird stories in the Old Testament that this helps explain. Saul and the witch of Endor, or excuse me, not Saul. Samuel, yeah, it is Saul, and he calls Samuel back, right? If you read that story, the witch kills the cow that's in the house. You're kind of like, this is weird. It's not. It's this kind of house. Right? Or the really strange one is the story of Jephthah and his daughter. You don't recall that the story. Jephthah in the Judges says, the first thing that comes out of the house I will sacrifice to you, God, right? Weird thing to say, right? It's a nod if you think you're going to get home from this battle you just won, and what's going to happen when you get home is someone's going to open the door to the stable part of the house, and the animals come out first. What happens instead is his daughter sees him coming, and she takes off. Right? And actually, it seems to be that they actually kill her. Right? It's a terrible story. Right? A very strange one, but it begins to make a sense of he's not a crazy person. He assumes an animal will come out. Right? This is the kind of house that they have. Right? So, I mean, there's just these kinds of things happening. Right? If you look at my handout on the back page, number 4, this is where I talk about the infancy gospel of James. I put a couple of quiz questions on it. Right? So if you read the biblical passage, what animals does Mary ride in on? We're not told. We're just not told. Right? What animals are present? Again, we're not told. Right? Did Jesus cry? Yes. I hate the hymn Away in a Manger. I'm sorry. It's awful. He cried. He was human. Where is the little drummer boy? Right? And yes, Mary knew. Right? We're actually told multiple times that she knew. Right? Again, we don't need to get rid of these hymns and these songs in the way that we observe this. It's just worth knowing where that version of the story comes from. Right? It comes from sort of late ancient world European culture, reading their own culture into the biblical text. We do this all the time, right? I read this and I want to say, well, you start to think, well, how would this work in our world? And we need to pause occasionally and say, some of these things that they're doing are very different from the way that we do things, right?
It's not like that in the movie.
Right. I mean, you can even think of all the art we get from the Renaissance era. I mean, they're all wearing clothes from that time, right? We do a better job of saying, well, I know they weren't wearing the jeans, right? But we also need to pay attention to the fact that the way that they're doing things is different. Right? The very cultural expectations are different. Right? I think the whole idea of there wasn't a room for them. We have this idea that when something like a birth happens, it's a very private affair. People want to be alone, right? It's something that not everyone should see. Sounds very strange to us, but that's just not how this world works, even to a day. Right? I mean, there would be a group of 10 to 12 women in this house helping. Right? And if they were strangers and didn't know anybody, that would still happen. They're not going to leave a pregnant woman to do this on her own. This isn't going to happen. Right? I mean, this is the part of the story that's like, there's no way this could work. Right? And I think it's actually worth pointing out, if you read translations translations of the Bible that come from the Middle East, so translations into things like Arabic or Syriac, they get these details. They catch on, it's a guest room. They understand where the animals are. Right? It's we who don't get it. Right?
If you watch one of the movies, about Elizabeth, she does have that group of women around
Yeah.
her and helping her. And when Mary was there, she saw that. So, I mean, I really get what you're saying about him already having his reservation and why he would be there. And now I understand more about the manger area and where he would actually be lying.
I mean, part of this is just if we say this is the way everybody else gave birth in this at this time or place, the story fits. Just that we don't know that that's how they did it, and so we read it a different way. Of course, there's other things happening too, right? Of the sort of standard way we tell the story supports all kinds of ideas about Mary and who she is. Right? If she also is this a saint who's free from a sin, right? Who also kind of tends to have almost supernatural powers, then she can do all this on her own. And having her stand apart makes a sense. So in the Eastern Orthodox Church, when they do communion or the Eucharist, it happens behind a veil. Like there's like a panel up. The priest goes back behind it and says, "This is my body, this is my blood," and then comes out with them. The people don't get to see the mystery happening. There's a way to sort of say this is what's happening in very early tellings of this story of it happens privately in a cave because we don't get to see what happens. We don't get to see God become flesh. That's a private thing, right? Mary does, right? And that's actually what happens in that this infancy gospel. What happens there is a cloud comes down and covers the cave when Joseph and the midwife are out on the side. And when then the cloud dissipates, they go in and the baby's there. And everybody's happy. There's no pain, there's no blood. Mary's happy, the baby's happy.
I was just thinking about the shepherds. Would the family accept them to come in?
Well, so I mean, this is again, I think one thing we can read into that part of the story of when they're told, you will find the babe wrapped in swaddling cloths and lying in a manger. It's good news to them because, he's just like us. He's not a king who's born in a palace where the parents are going to say, "You're not welcome here." The whole idea is you are welcome here. We're of the same class, right? So that's part of the good news is he's not like Herod. He's not like a Caesar. He's one of us, and he's born just like our children are. Right? I think this is that just kind of helps makes a sense of the story. Other questions?
It talks about the swaddling clothes.
Swaddling cloths, right. Well, do you have one too?
Well, I just wanted to know
Yeah.
on the house plant, SIVE, what does that mean?
Oh, that's supposed to say as a D. The side. That's,
It's actually
Oh, sorry.
elevation.
side. Sorry, my hand. That's from the side. That's from the
I had that in Greek or something.
The swaddling clothes. I mean, in one, it's so. Somewhere I put on here a verse. Ezekiel actually talks about. This is what they would do. They would wrap them up
It's down in
in swaddling cloths. I do think there's something to the idea is that there's a symbolism happening. So I think the story that we're given operates on multiple levels. One, it is a pretty accurate historical report. This is how it would have happened. These are the conditions. right? But why would you wrap him in swaddling cloths, right? And actually, it's a pretty technical term of bands of cloth, right? Because that's what you do with dead bodies. And I think there's a symbolism happening of saying he's going to be the one who dies for us, right? I also think that's where the cave imagery comes from. Of he's born in a cave, he's going to be buried in one. So I do think that there's intention